The McKenzian Blueprint, a historical playbook. Bruce Mackenzie was born in South Africa's province of Natal. By age 20 in 1939, he had joined the South African Air Force and was seconded to the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. On 2 occasions, his plane had been shot down and he was rescued adrift the Mediterranean after a 2-day ordeal with his face having been badly ripped. He needed reconstructive surgery, which his trademark bushy beard helped to conceal, as narrated by Fitz D'Souza, who became his close friend and confidant years later. After the war, he migrated to Kenya in 1946, where a thriving aristocratic Mzungu class was thriving in the White Highlands. His credentials as a war hero must have endeared him to this group. He had received the Distinguished Flying Cross, DFC, and the Distinguished Service Order, DSO. Further, war veterans and retired military officers from Britain were being encouraged to find abode in the colony of Kenya to ease the squabbling for estates with the British aristocracy. The forays of the British into Kenya mainland can be traced back to the slave trade era, with the Slave Trade Act being passed in 1807 making the purchase or ownership of enslaved people illegal within the British Empire, and the act being expanded in 1833 to allow for compensating the persons entitled to the services of enslaved people. The British colonial government, on the one hand, was under pressure from philanthropists and missionaries to end slavery. In the process of transforming the institution of slavery, the British implemented a gradual policy in order to avert abrupt abolition that could have led to the collapse of the plantation economy founded on slave labor, with Sir Clement Hill urging tact and a little judicious closing of the official eye. Enslaved people were categorized into various groups that determined the status and superiority of one group over the others. Home-born enslaved people were referred to as Mimzaliwa, and were normally attached to their master's house, while those who served their masters in the household were known as Hadamu. Domestic enslaved people were the most kindly treated of all and formed part of the master's household. Enslaved people who did petty jobs were known as Matumwa, and the ones who were assigned to work in the plantations were called Memtwana. Large slave owners owned an average of 150 enslaved people who worked in their plantations. For instance, Suleiman bin Abdallah al-Mawli owned 261 enslaved people who worked on over 1,000 acres of land in Malindi. As seen in the actions of Sir John Kirk, the British Consul General in Zanzibar, 1870-86, who outlawed the owning of enslaved people by non-Muslims, the nascent British colonial administration initially recognized the institution of slavery based on the fact that slavery was sanctioned by Islam and practiced in the Busaidi Sultanate. It provided them plausible deniability while imposing indirect rule through the Sultan's system. As discussed in the opening section, naval might established rights. The British had sufficient naval and gunship superiority to deter the Sultan from making unilateral decisions without their counsel. Britain also feared that much pressure on the Sultan could force him into an alliance with Napoleon, who was a constant threat to Britain. The French pressurized Majid bin Said, .1856 reals, 1870, to abrogate the Hamerton Treaty in 1845, which prohibited slave trade between Oman and Zanzibar, so as to permit enslaved people to be shipped to French plantations in Reunion Islands. French efforts to persuade Majid failed, and instead they backed his brother Bargash bin Said in a coup d'etat on the throne of Zanzibar. When the attempt failed, Bargash was offered asylum by the French consulate in Zanzibar. In 1889, Sultan Khalifa bin Said, who ruled between 1888 and 1890, established the Declaration on the Limitation of Claims, which stated that any piece of land unoccupied for more than 12 years reverted to the state, Sultanate of Zanzibar. I wonder who advised on this novel declaration since the Sultan ruled by decree? Nevertheless, British colonial officials took advantage of it to validate their policy to declare any unoccupied land as abandoned land. As relayed by the letter from James Weaver, the Assistant District Officer Malindi to H. Crawford, Sub-Commissioner, the 3rd of June, 1896, judgments were entered to suit expediency, stating that, in one case, a Lady Salima binti Masood claimed that Mohammed bin Said had encroached on her piece of land. The district officials ruled against her because the land had been abandoned for more than 3 years. It was noted that British officials perceived land to be abandoned land once it was covered with bush. No surveys were undertaken. Measurement and determination were literally visual.